Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, May 25th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Georgia, this election that occurred last evening in the Tuesday primary, a very hotly contested race, or at least otherwise thought, where Donald Trump put a lot of money and a lot of time into all of these races. He made endorsements ranging from Attorney General to Secretary of State to governor across the state, even down to some more minuscule races such as the Georgia 10th Congressional District or the Insurance Commissioner's race. All around, Donald Trump put a lot of time, put a lot of his weight and power behind many of these candidates, all of which who came up short last evening, with the exception of the Senate race. That was Herschel Walker's race, where he was able to win by about 54 percentage points across the state. Beyond that, Donald Trump has suffered maybe 5 to 6 more losses and likely will suffer further down the line as 2 of the congressional races head off into a runoff election where the Trump-endorsed candidates don't look as if they are poised for victory. Now, in yesterday's video, we talked about the governor's race where Brian Kemp had defeated David Perdue, and so it looked during the time and recording of the video by about 50 percentage points. By the end of the evening, and now today, around midday on the state of, on Wednesday, with about 97% of the vote counted, Brian Kemp has defeated David Perdue in every single county across the state and done so by about 52 percentage points. David Perdue said that there is no way that he's down by 30 points when he was asked about a poll from Fox News that showed him down by such a large margin. And he was right. He was instead down by 52 points. And this loss comes as a huge shock, I would say, to David Perdue, but not so much to those who view it from the outside. I think the shock also goes to President Donald Trump, who partially was gearing up for this potential defeat. The proportion of the loss is just so enormous. A 52-point margin. Just 1 in 5 voters were able to back David Perdue when nearly 3 in 4 voters were backing Brian Kemp is insane. David Perdue is a former statewide elected official. He was elected before Brian Kemp. Voters knew his name before they knew Brian Kemp's name. And Donald Trump has made it his mission to ensure that Brian Kemp loses. But he isn't the only one. We're not only going to be talking about the governor's race today, but we're going to go ahead and scroll down and look at another primary that was expected to be extremely competitive. Well, it looks like it was competitive, but not in the way that Donald Trump wanted it to be. Brad Raffensperger, his name might ring a bell because he confirmed the 2020 election results in the state of Georgia and refused to overturn the election results as directed by President Donald Trump. When Donald Trump said to Brad Raffensperger, please find 11,000 votes, he was directly stating to Raffensperger that he wanted him to intervene in the election to some extent. In addition to that, Donald Trump had called on attorney generals across the United States, including in the state of Georgia, to join this election lawsuit against the Democratic Party, against the Biden-Harris campaign, to try to, quote-unquote, expose the voter fraud that occurred in Georgia and Arizona. Coincidentally, or not coincidentally, it just so happens that Donald Trump didn't try to sue any of the states that he ended up winning for any election irregularities, because why would you? Brad Raffensperger won this Secretary of State election last night, even though he was one of the major opponents of President Trump in the eyes of the MAGA group across the United States. Donald Trump had vehemently gone against Brad Raffensperger time and time again. Every time he went to Georgia, attacked Raffensperger, attacked Kemp, and that ultimately didn't pay off. Now, who is Jody Heiss? Well, Jody Heiss is a former United States congressman. That's right. He left the United States Congress to run for Secretary of State. He wasn't in a competitive district. He wasn't in a position where redistricting had screwed him over. Rather, he thought that he would be able to win this easily. And for many people, they also agreed. If you look at the political betting markets, Jody Heiss had a lead over Raffensperger for months at a time. And the reason for that was because President Donald Trump committed himself to these people. He committed himself to Jody Heiss. He committed himself to David Perdue. And what came up of it? Absolutely nothing. Raffensperger didn't even head off into a primary runoff election. And that's the most shocking thing about this. Raffensperger coming out ahead, I wouldn't say is the most shocking part of what we saw in last night's election for obvious reason, but the polling data had expected him to be somewhere around even with Heiss. Look at these numbers. Look how close it was by the end of the election. Heiss ended up coming out ahead by the final day of polling. But as the results show, Raffensperger ended up not only avoiding a runoff election, but winning just simply in a way that was never really expected. He was expected to be tied, in one hand even, lower than Jody Heiss. You take a look at the University of Georgia poll from March 20th through April 8th, Heiss is at 30, Raffensperger is at 23. Another poll from Landmark Communications just a month and a half ago, What do you find? Well, it shows Jody Heiss at 35% and Raffensperger at 18%. As we got closer and closer to the election, Raffensperger started to do better, but by the final poll from Landmark Communications, Jody Heiss had improved to 39%, Raffensperger had improved to 38%, with about 11% undecided. And as we see from these results, almost all of that 11% undecided went to Raffensperger, and Jody Heiss actually ended up doing worse than what the polling averages had expected him to do. Now, I don't think that polls for these individual statewide races are always going to be accurate. There were very few, to be completely fair with you, despite how competitive this race was expected to be. I think many people expected Donald Trump's nominee to end up winning, largely because Raffensperger has been in major headlines. He's been talked about, praised by Democrats, vilified by Republicans, and what came up of it? A victory for the incumbent. But as I said, we're not just talking about the governor's race, we're talking about this one. But let's go ahead and move over to another race where Donald Trump suffered yet another statewide electoral defeat. And that comes into the insurance commissioner race. Now, this is an entirely inconsequential race. I will say that this is not a race that we watch closely by any metric, but Donald Trump did make a pick. He chose Patrick Witt, a former Trump administration official who previously ran for the U.S. House, pivoted over to the insurance commissioner. And Donald Trump's endorsement, I believe, probably would be, very impactful. John King wasn't elected in the first place. You go back to 2018, he did not actually end up being on that ballot. He was not the nominee for the Republican Party. He came into this position because of a resignation. Brian Kemp appointed him, and now he is the incumbent. But he didn't have that statewide recognition. All he had was the incumbency status by his name. On the other hand, Patrick Witt had the endorsement of President Trump. While he also isn't a statewide recognized official, he had the endorsement of a very powerful man, especially in the Republican Party. And what do we find in these polls? While John King was ahead, it ultimately ended up being a pretty good victory for John King, and a defeat for yet again another Trump-endorsed candidate. The only break that Donald Trump caught last night was with Herschel Walker. And the most shocking part of that, too, is that Herschel Walker did worse than Brian Kemp in terms of overall percentage of the vote. Despite Herschel Walker being that named Senate nominee for months now, a year and a half now, since April of 2021, a year, right? So when you see what happened, when you see how Donald Trump's influence led Herschel Walker to victory, and yet no one else decided to contest Herschel Walker, whereas Donald Trump endorsed a lot of these other candidates on a very similar time frame for very similar reasons, and also even invested millions of dollars into many of these races. What do you find? They end up performing significantly worse. In fact, they all lose, except for Herschel Walker, who still couldn't outperform a governor who was attacked time and time again by the Republican Party's most powerful man. And it isn't just this insurance and safety fire commissioner race, but also another consequential race in the attorney general's race. You take a look, Donald Trump endorsed John Gordon, a businessman who had the endorsement from President Trump, but was never able to get higher up in the polls. On a low, he was at 9%, on a high at 24%, and in the actual results, ended up only getting about 26% of the vote. Chris Carr, on the other hand, as the incumbent, won 74% of the vote, despite not being the Trump-endorsed candidate. And it doesn't end here. I mentioned some individual races in the House elections. Well, let's head over to Georgia's 10th congressional district, where in this race, we are now in a position where it heads to a runoff on the Republican side. But Vernon Jones is a name you might recognize because he was previously running for governor. He was getting about 10 to 15% of the support. He was really vying for Donald Trump's victory, Donald Trump's endorsement. And then Donald Trump spoke to him and said, drop out of the governor's race, or at least this is all speculation, but it came out a very interesting time in the way that it all maneuvered. He said, drop out of the governor's race, endorse David Perdue, and run for House. And I will endorse you, and that will easily carry you to victory. And I'm sure Vernon Jones agreed. But as we can see in these results, Vernon Jones couldn't even crack 25%. He's now heading to a runoff. We will see what happens there, but I wouldn't be too hopeful on his side. With the Trump endorsement, couldn't even crack 1/4 of the vote. I doubt he will do any better in the runoff election. And in the Georgia, let's go ahead and see here. Let's see the Jake Evans right here in the 6th congressional district, the one where it has now been redistricted into an overwhelming Republican area. Jake Evans is the Trump-endorsed candidate. He was running against Rich McCormick, not an incumbent, but someone who did very well in last night's results, getting 43% of the vote. Jake Evans has had the Trump endorsement for quite some time now, and yet couldn't even crack, again, 1/4 of the vote. It's as if Donald Trump's endorsement didn't matter in Georgia. It mattered in North Carolina. It mattered in many other states where we saw some very important races. Pennsylvania, for instance, where that Senate GOP primary might still be going on, but the governor's primary was an easy takeaway for Doug Mastriano because of Trump's endorsement alongside Mastriano's ability to win. While these candidates might all be, in a sense, bad candidates for these races, it's laughable to see that there is such a significant portion of them losing. The way that I see this is that Trump's endorsement should have been golden. It should have been enough to carry even the worst candidate at least somewhere closer to the finish line. But when you're down by 20 points in a preliminary election, where you're not even faced up against just one other opponent, but rather 5, and someone's beating you by 20 points, you get over to another race where you've been in close communication with President Trump for a year and a half now, campaigned for him back in 2020, campaigned for the Republicans in the 2021 runoffs, and yet couldn't even crack 1/4 of the vote in an overwhelmingly Republican district where a Trump endorsement matters and matters to a very high extent. What we are finding here is that Donald Trump suffered some major losses last night. No matter where you look at the House, he has losses. You look at the random races that went down the finish line or went down the ballot line, and what you were finding is that Donald Trump didn't do that well. In fact, lost everything but the Senate race. And that Senate race was overwhelmingly expected. No one thought that Herschel Walker was going to lose. But Herschel Walker, while doing exactly how the polls had predicted, did not do better than Brian Kemp by overall percentage. And that's a main takeaway that I am truly shocked about, because Brian Kemp should have been so easy in another reality to take down. David Perdue ran an awful campaign. Brian Kemp ran a wonderful campaign. And I don't use these in a sense to praise or diminish these politicians, but more so the way their campaigns were ran. From a political analysis standpoint, Brian Kemp did everything right. David Perdue did everything wrong. And Donald Trump chose all of the wrong candidates. Trump endorsed Brian Kemp in 2018 and landed him a victory in the governor's office. He decided to turn against him, but voters didn't care. As much as Trump would like to spend a lot of his time talking about how Raffensperger and Kemp are bad for America, going out against Kemp, saying that even Abrams might be better than Brian Kemp, this type of rhetoric and this type of maneuvering politically did not actually benefit these other Republicans that were endorsed by President Trump as much as I'm sure they thought it would. Because truly speaking, Donald Trump did practically everything that he could. Besides maybe going down a few more times, besides maybe holding a few more fundraisers, what we found was that Brian Kemp and the more moderate, or I would say not necessarily more moderate because they're all, on a sense, a very similar level of conservatism, but the more establishment Republicans unified against these Trump opposition candidates or these Trump open race candidates, and they ended up succeeding in every race but the Senate race, where they probably were better off by backing Herschel Walker instead of Gary Black or someone else down the line. Because Herschel Walker probably is the most electable Senate GOP candidate, at least amongst the list that is running. I'm sure they could have pulled someone better, but this was probably the best pick, which is why they probably didn't contest it. Had they contested this with Herschel Walker in the race, they probably could have taken him down too. Because Donald Trump endorsed Herschel Walker in a very similar level that he endorsed David Perdue. And yet David Perdue couldn't even crack the percentage that he was expected to in polling data. Take a look at these numbers and find, that David Perdue was expected to get 35%. He got 22%. Brian Kemp was expected to get 55%. He got 74%. The results show that the voters in Georgia didn't really care about the Trump endorsement as much as we thought. While it may be an individual state, there could be some trends here. There could be something to be said about Trump's endorsement flopping in Georgia, but succeeding in other states. I truly am invested into how this endorsement really makes its mark. Because in Pennsylvania, it worked. In North Carolina, it worked. In some other far and in-between races, it has worked. It's lost on some accounts. We saw, the state of Nebraska go a different way than Trump had intended, but that was a very close race. Just a few percentage points difference, and you could have had a Trump-endorsed nominee win. But in states like Georgia, you are seeing a complete and total smackdown of the former president. With his candidates, with his endorsees, whoever it might be, Trump's rhetoric and Trump's endorsements are being completely neglected because voters like these Republicans more. Or they just simply favor these incumbents. But sometimes if you take a look at these races, there are non-incumbent races where guess again, the non-Trump endorsed candidates end up doing better. It is just a fascinating thing to see within the GOP, this level of difference between the Trump endorsement making a positive impact, a negative impact, or just not benefiting a candidate at all. I don't think Donald Trump's endorsement was detrimental to any Republicans, but what I do think is that it didn't help nearly as much as it needed to, and it landed some very large defeats for all of these Trump-endorsed candidates, giving a very bad name, I would say, to President Trump and his impact on the Republican Party, meaning that when 2024 comes around, he doesn't have a lot of these candidates to turn to and say, I got you elected, because he directly opposed them in the primary in the first place. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.